your best in the world by doing the impossible, like selling over 100 million PlayStation 1s when nobody knew your name. But here's the problem with doing something like this. Once you raise expectations that high, you have to break that record again. And Sony basically said, hell yeah, let's do it. So this is the story of how the PS2 became the best in the world, back when nobody even knew Sony's name, and it's also proof that you can always do better with a bit of luck, and maybe with a little cheating. Until 1994, Sony wasn't a huge player in gaming. In fact, they weren't even in the gaming industry. They made TVs and other electronics. But when they decided to step into gaming, they got betrayed by Nintendo over their CD technology. So they got extremely mad and launched the PS1 in 1994, and it went absolutely crazy. Here's the thing, the PS1 wasn't the only console with 3D games, but it was revolutionary because it made 3D gaming the industry standard. Nintendo and Sega both had 3D, but Sony? Sony made 3D gaming what everyone expected, what everyone wanted, what everyone demanded, and just like that, you sold over 100 million PlayStation 1 units. But you weren't done. You were coming for more, and now it was time for the PlayStation 2. Sony's executives realized something that would change everything. People didn't want to buy a $300 gaming console, but they would buy a $300 DVD player that just happened to play games. In 2000, DVD players cost an average of $700. The PS2 launched at $299 with a DVD player built in. This wasn't just a feature, it was strategic warfare disguised as consumer value. It became known as the Trojan horse strategy, meaning parents who would never buy a video game machine suddenly had an excuse. It wasn't just for the kids. It was a home entertainment system for the whole family. Best Buy and Circuit City placed PS2s in their home theater sections, not just the gaming aisles. Sony had essentially given away a gaming console with every DVD player purchase. For many, Microsoft and Nintendo were selling gaming consoles. But Sony was selling the future of a home entertainment. That's why some called it Sony cheating. But that wasn't the only trick. Here's where Sony got really clever. Every PS2 could play PS1 games. All 102 million PS1 owners already had a library ready to go, and those games worked on day one. Why was this genius? Because you weren't abandoning your old games. You were upgrading your experience, now with a DVD player built in. Parents also didn't have to buy new games immediately, because the PS2 was fully backward compatible. It created an instant value proposition. Keep everything you already have, just make it better. Xbox and GameCube launched with 0 games. The PS2 launched with over 1,000 titles you could play immediately. That's a rigged game from the very start, but that wasn't all. Sony launched the PS2 in March 2000 in Japan, and in October 2000 in North America. The Xbox wouldn't arrive until November 2001. GameCube, September. That gave Sony 18 months of total market dominance. And here's the real genius. By the time Xbox and GameCube launched, the PS2 had already sold over 20 million units. Developers had already committed, retailers had already stocked shelves, gamers were already playing Final Fantasy and Metal Gear Solid. Microsoft and Nintendo weren't just late to the party. They showed up after Sony had already won. But this wasn't only about the players. Developers also had to make games for PlayStation 2. Sony didn't just convince them, they made it financially impossible not to. The numbers told the brutal truth. Xbox install base? 9 million. GameCube install base? 12 million. PS2 install base? 50 million. That dominance supercharged the PlayStation 2's library with legendary titles like Metal Gear Solid, God of War, Shadow of the Colossus, and countless more. So let me know, what's your favorite PS2 game? Every exclusive made the PS2 more attractive, and every new PS2 buyer made exclusives more likely. This created a death spiral for competitors. Fewer consoles meant fewer exclusive games, which meant even fewer console sales, which led developers to abandon ship, and the last thing you want is developers leaving your platform. Sony wasn't playing fair. They weren't even playing to win. They were playing to make sure nobody else could, and they had other plans too. Sony didn't just get developers to make games. They stole everyone else's best franchises. And the betrayals were brutal. Final Fantasy jumped ship from Nintendo to Sony. This was massive because Final Fantasy was one of Nintendo's most important titles. When it left, it was devastating. Some even say PlayStation finally got its revenge in another way. Combine that with titles like Metal Gear Solid, Tekken, Resident Evil, and Crash Bandicoot, PlayStation had something for everybody. But here's the genius move. Sony didn't even own most of these franchises. They just made sure the games launched on PlayStation first, or looked best on PlayStation, or became forever associated with PlayStation in gamers' minds. But here's something nobody talks about. The PS2's $299 launch price was actually a loss for Sony. They were losing money on every console sold, betting everything that DVD players would normalize the price, and that game sales would eventually bring profit. The gamble was simple. It cost around $450 to manufacture each unit at launch. Sony sold them for $299, losing about $150 per console, but making it back through games. And here's the genius. By the time Xbox and GameCube launched at similar prices, the PS2 had already dropped to $199. Suddenly, Sony's expensive console looked like the budget option. The competition was struggling to match yesterday's price, while Sony was already playing tomorrow's game. Sony didn't market the PS2 as just a gaming console. They marketed it as a status symbol. That's why the competition never had a chance. Sega's Dreamcast lasted only 2 years. Microsoft's Xbox launched 18 months late, and even with better specs, it didn't matter when the PS2 had all the hype and all the games. And Nintendo's GameCube? By using mini discs instead of DVDs, they instantly lost the home theater market. Even with a strong fan base, it couldn't withstand the PlayStation 2's momentum and took a massive loss that generation. But here's what most people don't realize. Sony wasn't just fighting a console war. They were fighting to redefine their entire brand. In 2000, Sony had a problem. The Walkman was dying. MP3 players and iPods were coming. Their electronics were becoming outdated. They needed a new flagship product that screamed Sony innovation. The PS2 wasn't just a gaming console. It was Sony's new identity. Think about it. Before PS2, when you thought Sony, you thought Walkman, old TVs, products your parents bought. Safe, reliable, but not exciting anymore. After PlayStation 2, Sony meant cutting-edge entertainment. The PS2's success created a halo effect across Sony's entire lineup. PS2 in the living room normalized Sony in modern homes. Suddenly, their TVs made sense. Perfect for my PS2. Their sound systems became gaming accessories. The PS2's sleek black design influenced everything. Sony TVs, cameras, laptops, all went black and modern. Here's the genius part. While Microsoft was trying to break into gaming and Nintendo was trying to save gaming, Sony was using gaming to save their entire brand relevance. The PS2 generated over $20 billion in revenue. But the real value, making Sony mean innovation. Again, when Walkman was dead, it transformed Sony, fading electronics giant, into a modern entertainment powerhouse. But did Sony actually cheat? Technically, no. But they rewrote the entire rulebook. They understood something their competitors missed. Gaming consoles don't just compete with each other. They compete with every other entertainment device fighting for space in your living room. Sony's so-called cheats were actually genius moves. DVD player integration equals a Trojan horse into living rooms. Backward compatibility equals instant loyalty lock-in. Early launch equals market dominance before competition arrived. Developer advantage equals a self-fulfilling prophecy. Selling at a loss equals a long-term strategic bet. Lifestyle marketing equals expanding far beyond just gamers. And it all started when Sony was betrayed by Nintendo in 1991. Out of pure revenge, they launched the PS1 in 1994 and sold 102 million units. Then they did something even more impressive. They took that anger, that hunger, that refusal to lose and built the greatest gaming empire the world had ever seen. 155 million PlayStation 2s sold, not because it had the best graphics, not because it had the most power, but because Sony understood one simple truth. The best way to win isn't to beat your competitors. It's to make them irrelevant before the fight even begins. Sony didn't cheat. They just played a different game entirely. That's domination.